A noble named Werner, a favorite of the royal child, carried on a sacrilegious traffic in bishoprics, abbacies, and other offices of trust. So I think, well, why would nobles have a motive to do that? Well, the fact of the matter is that there are resources attached to such things. Obviously, there's a certain diocesan income that could be quite considerable in a large diocese. An abbey has property. Monastery, religious orders have property. The rules are different for different orders, but some religious orders own property. Maybe the individual members might take vows of poverty, but the order itself has ownership of things. So other offices of trust, all of those things require the monetary resources in some way, in some form, to exist, to be sustained, to carry on their functions. So people can get involved in either trying to acquire those for themselves and in the sense of having an ecclesiastical career, or just completely out from outside the church seize control of them for the very lowest of motives, just to get rich quick. And that happens. And sometimes the resources of the church, the property of the church in different places could be truly enormous. It was some huge percentage. It was at least 30% of all the territory in Germany at the time of Martin Luther was owned by the church, if not more. Maybe a third. So it was a lot of that territory, and that's an awful lot of property, and obviously a great deal of wealth going along with it. The same was true in England when Henry VIII went into schism. He seized all the wealth of the monasteries that were there, which was quite a lot. You can tell if you go and visit the monasteries that he ruined. You can tell that their ruins are still standing to this day. They were destroyed many centuries ago, but you could tell that they were built so solidly that had they not been purposely destroyed, they'd still be standing today. And there are older structures than those still standing today. They were knocked down on purpose by the creature. So all of those that in short is the motive why nobles might be involved in this sort of thing, in seizing the property of the church. So with a view to check the flagrant disorder, Pope Nicholas turned to the man who wielded a paramount influence for good in Germany. This was St. Anno, Archbishop of Cologne. He wrote to him in pressing terms, urging him to make use of his power and to put an end to the Seminary, which disgraced the churches of his country. The apostolic reproof only embittered the froward spirit. So St. Anno was not upset, but the general response to this attempt to set things straight was not good. And I think people can get to the point of being so entrenched in their evil ways that they see any attempt to correct them as an evil to themselves. And that it's surprising the circumstances under which that can take place. Remember when, to what extent you might call them evil ways, but remember when Saint Benedict very famously was attempting to instill greater discipline in the monastery that he was, of which he was the abbot, that the monks there tried to poison him. Not so much they didn't like what he was doing. So that can happen amongst religious. Certainly, it can happen amongst other people who are not even outwardly professing to be pursuing perfection in the spiritual life. So very often this kind of thing happens. People respond to, look at it as an evil to themselves. Because and that's how they truly perceive it. Remember, nobody seeks evil as evil, only for some good aspect, at least perceived good aspect of it. Thinking it is a good thing in itself, or because of some aspect of it that they like and therefore perceive as something good. And so they perceive that good thing that they have is being taken from them, and therefore they perceive it as an evil, at which they get angry. So the nobles and bishops assembled in a great diet of the empire, forbade the name of Nicholas II to be mentioned in the canon of the Mass, and even dared to send him a sentence of excommunication. So notice that is obviously, for not mentioning name in the canon of the Mass, is something that is very obviously connected to schism. Right, the point to be made there is obvious. The account of this incredible enormity, and both of those things are enormous, of course. Attempting to excommunicate the Pope, which nobody has the jurisdiction to do, obviously. It's painfully obvious, nobody can do that. And also, that is truly enormous as well, to try to bring it about that the name of the Pope not be mentioned in the canon of the Mass. All of that counts as incredible enormity. And this threw a gloom over the last days of the Holy Pontiff, who was overtaken by an untimely death while in, 2 words there, Florence. He passed away in June of 1061. Nicholas II bequeathed to the papacy and to the world the memory of the greatest deeds accomplished in a pontificate which lasted but 2 years. So you see, some personalities, very active, can accomplish a great deal in a relatively very short span of time. Whereas others might have a much longer time in a similar position and not accomplish as much. Of course, there actually have to be the resources, the means available to accomplish things, but yeah, you can see that someone with a lot of drive can accomplish a great deal very quickly. So his piety and charity were a subject of edification to his very enemies. So true and reverent, says St. Peter Damian, was his affection for the indigent members of Jesus Christ, that he never passed a day without washing the feet of 12 poor men brought from the different quarters of Rome. So you see, there's are constant examples of this sort of thing throughout the history of the Church, but accusations on the part of socialists and similar types who accuse the Church of never having paid attention to the material needs of people is clearly utter nonsense. Obviously, there are more important needs, and it is to those that the Church attends most directly. That is the most immediately the concern of the Church. But that doesn't exclude material needs, and the Church certainly has provided for those. And saints have dedicated their lives to works of charity, making life easier for people with regard to their material needs. Not purely, but they dedicated their lives to, in the sense that they made themselves conspicuous even while on earth through. Now all that can be through supernatural charity, and therefore greatly meritorious, but became conspicuous while on earth. That's their claim to fame, how much they dedicated their lives just to running charitable institutions that took care of people that needed it. So people who like all those accusations, for one thing, show they know nothing at all about the history of the Church or what the Church has done, and probably just do it with the end of just trying to make the Church look as evil as possible. Because any reasonable person who does any kind of minimal research concerning the many centuries of the activity of the Church can easily see that that's just utter nonsense. So, at the very least, such a person is, if it's not a malicious attack, then it's speaking through gross ignorance, and neither one of those is acceptable. All right, so moving on to the pontificate of Alexander II. Cardinal Etienne was immediately deputed to the court of Germany, in accordance with the decree of Nicholas II, to consult with the young prince about the election of a pope. So this is, as we have mentioned here, in accordance with the decree of a previous pope, the most recent one in this case, that the emperor be consulted, and the pope can require that. But the courtiers allowed him no access to the monarch, and after several fruitless efforts, the cardinal was obliged to return to Rome. The factions were in a state of the greatest excitement. The imperial chancellor Guibert of Parma, who ruled Italy in the name of Henry IV, sold abbacies and bishoprics and favored the disorder of morals in order to swell his profits. So, we mentioned before that it's all for the lowest motives, and there you go. Case in point. He openly announced that he desired the election of a pope disposed to absolve the simoniacal and irregular ecclesiastics, and that the severity of Nicholas II had imposed upon the clergy a galling yoke which they were no longer willing to bear. Of course, that's not true, not in itself. Maybe they were not willing to bear it, but whatever he imposed on them was not in itself unreasonable, and therefore cannot be characterized as galling. And of course, even if it's hard to see a true pope ever refusing to punish simony, but even in the case of simony not being published in any place in the church where the sin is being committed, it's still a sin. It's still one thing, spiritual things, these offices of the church cannot be validly bought or sold. And the attempt to do so is a sacrilege that we call simony, and will always remain so. That will never change. So it will always be sinful, and therefore those who do those things are always deserving of punishment, of course, assuming that they do so pertinaciously. And it'd be hard to consider imagine a case in which someone does not do it without some sense that this really is inappropriate, at least on some gut level, on some instinctive level. We should realize that, just common sense. But yeah, definitely, in principle, those who do those things deserve to be punished. And also, irregular ecclesiastics, an irregularity is something that's, as implied here, attached to the person, and it's more than, say, an impediment to something. So impediments to the priesthood, there are, in canon law, I have listed impediments to the priesthood as well as irregularities, which are longer lasting. So an impediment could be done away with, an irregularity stays. So definitely, yes, somebody somebody that may in fact bring about an irregularity. But you have to check there are different lists of things. It's all according to the law of the church. What is an irregularity versus what is a simple impediment? So an irregularity is worse than an impediment. So for example, to impersonate someone in major orders brings about an irregularity, meaning that that's on the person's permanent record, as far as the church is concerned. This person is not in major orders, impersonated somebody in major orders. That is considered extremely serious for obvious reason. So meanwhile, the Archdeacon Hildebrand, the life of the church, in those calamitous days assembled the cardinals and Roman lords in Rome. Under his influence, Anselm, Bishop of Lucca, was canonically elected to succeed Nicholas II and took the name Alexander II. So it seems that the decree of the previous pope to consult with the emperor before proceeding to an election could not be conformed to because the emperor wouldn't cooperate. But notice here, we still, so okay, we can't do that. They just proceed to the other canonical proceedings for the election of a pope, and a true pope emerges. So maybe the laws technically weren't all followed, but because they couldn't be. And still a true pope was elected. It was hoped that the choice would prove acceptable to the court of Germany, where the new pope was personally known, as he had once held some offices within its limits. In refusing to receive the envoy of the Apostolic College, Henry IV had doubtless acted under the impulse of resentment at the rebuke administered by Pope Nicholas II. So in other words, there wasn't much reason to hope that he would ever cooperate. No doubt was felt that he would return to a more friendly state of feeling, and least of all could it have been reasonably expected that he should complain that the pontifical election was carried on without his concurrence, since he had refused to receive the communications of Etienne on the subject. So, nevertheless, such was the case, probably is meant to go with the following paragraph. Nevertheless, he, the emperor, showed the most violent anger that the election of Alexander II should have been carried on without his consent. So he had his chance. There was an effort made to conform to that. If he wanted that to be done, he should have cooperated, obviously. The idea of having the emperor involved in the choosing of the pope is to make sure that the election is, the integrity of the election can be trusted, not so that the emperor can hold the church to ransom, obviously. That's clearly not the intention of the pope, the previous pope. So really, this is a good instance of applying epikeia to a particular law, because clearly that was not in the mind of Nicholas II. That's the emperor should have this power to deprive all the faithful of the leadership, of the guidance of a true living, reigning pope because of that law. Clearly not. But that's what that law was in fact bringing about under those circumstances, so they set it aside, and obviously rightly so. So considering as null all that had been done without his cooperation, he proceeded to nominate an anti-pope. Things going from bad to worse here. So Carlos, Bishop of Parma, had the mean ambition to accept this disgraceful part. That's an older use of the word mean, meaning very low. The base. Today we'd say more, we'd say base. Use the adjective base. Had the base, very low ambition to accept this disgraceful part. He was consecrated by the two bishops of Vercelli and Placenza and took the name of Honorius II. Catullus, and notice that we're referring to him here by just his regular name, not his supposed papal name, and that's typically done in the cases of antipopes, to refer to them not by the papal names that they claim, because lest there be any confusion that they may have actually been real popes. Now, Catullus had dishonored the episcopate by notorious simony and flagrant irregularities. The very thought of placing such a man upon the chair of St. Peter was a subject of scandal. The report of his intrusion aroused the indignation of every Catholic. Peter Damian, ever ready to spring, so St. Peter Damian now, ever ready to spring to the breach when the honor of the church was at stake, addressed a spirited letter to the antipope, upbraiding him with his crimes and administering a scathing rebuke to the miserable vanity which could sacrifice the good of the whole church to his personal interest. So, you can pretty easily predict what he says, what he's going to say, so we don't have to read every word of it, but the whole world beholds and blushes with indignation. What's going on here? Good words. I'm going to address these, maybe not necessarily the exact crimes, but so much of this could be addressed to the Novus Ordo popes, that's for sure. In any case, unmoved by this energetic rebuke, Catullus raised an army and appeared before the walls of Rome. He was encouraged at first by some slight successes, but the arrival of Godfrey, Duke of Tuscany, changed the face of affairs. Today we'd more likely say the state of affairs, but the antipope was vigorously repulsed and only succeeded in effecting his escape by means of gold. So he bought his way out of it. So he seems to be using money for everything. Still, in his retirement at Parma, he did not abandon his fatal enterprise. So, good that was unsuccessful, but still, the emperor. It's the real scandal here. At least in this instance, the deeper problem, the underlying problem anyway, is that the emperor was involved in this. Had it not been for the emperor's involvement, this antipope would probably not have ever appeared. So some antipopes appear on their own. Others are propped up by various monarchs who want to cause trouble. And that's definitely the case of Henry IV. And Peter Damian wrote to Henry IV, entreating the youthful monarch to put an end to the evils now desolating the church. He thus speaks of the union which should exist between the papacy and the empire. As the two powers of priest and king are united in Jesus Christ, the same mutual union should exist among the Christian people. They stand in need of each other. The priesthood is shared by royalty, and royalty leans upon the holiness of the priesthood. The king bears the sword to wield it against the church's foes. The pontiff watches, it should be, and prays to call down the blessings of God upon kings and subjects. The king must settle worldly difficulties by justice. The pontiff feed a famished people with food from heaven. The king is empowered to check the wicked by the authority of the laws. The pontiff is entrusted with the keys to use either the rigor of the canons or the indulgence of the church. So, that is an excellent way of summing up the correct union of church and state. So these, and just a summing up, I can explain it all in much greater detail than that, but that's a good illustration of some of the things that church and state do in conjunction with each other. Just how their different immediate ends complement each other very nicely. So these wise considerations would doubtless have produced but little fruit on the heart of Henry IV, but the fear of seeing Italy throw off his yoke, should he persist in supporting antipope, was a more powerful motive in the councils of the German court. So for political interests, political reasons, concerns of keeping the empire together, that's where the concerns amongst the emperor's counselors are. A motive of personal interest easily changed the course of policy. St. Anno, Archbishop of Cologne, was sent to end the troubles in Italy. The Holy Archbishop held a council at Mantua, where the election of Alexander II was solemnly confirmed. Carlos was formally condemned and deposed from the episcopate. But still he would not yield, as sometimes they don't. By a skillful maneuver, it's an older spelling of that word, but there you go. By a skillful maneuver, so meaning, of course, a maneuver typically means moving a vehicle or something like that while it's in motion to get around an obstacle or something. But it could also be, or perhaps maneuvering a body of armed men, or maneuvering an army, for example. But here it just means making a move. By a skillful move, he gained possession of the Leonine city and the Church of St. John Lateran, but notice that the indignant people drove him out. So it's not as though the people of Rome, the Roman mob has been a source of a lot of trouble, for sure, throughout history, but it's not as though they're completely insensitive to questions of orthodoxy and legitimacy in the papacy. And so, shutting himself up with a few soldiers in the castle of Sant'Angelo, which you can, of course, still go see today, he stood a siege of 2 years against the troops of Alexander II. And it's perfectly normal, actually, that there be, since papal troops, not only for personal bodyguards, obviously, those are, as is the case of the famous Swiss Guard, but also that the papal states, just as any temporal kingdom, should also have a military to defend itself, is a normal thing in itself. Typically, the armies of the papal states weren't very successful because popes obviously are not going to be paying much more attention to other things than to running of a military. But they're always there. You see them mentioned from time to time: papal troops, papal soldiers, papal armies. And not usually very successful, but sometimes, on occasion, accomplish the immediate intended goal. So reduced at last to the direst want, he succeeded in escaping and went to die in an isolated spot, covered with public contempt, but still persisting to the last in usurping the pontifical functions. So freed from the repeated attacks of this Carlos character, the Pope returned his attention to the suppression of an error then spreading to the provinces of Tuscany, and called the heresy, something isn't quite right there, but which was called, in any case, the heresy of the incestuous. So, incest is a sin on its own. That doesn't necessarily involve any heresy. And it's an attempted marriage, or even just, even without any attempted marriage, of sexual relations between two people who are too closely related, either too closely related to get married, or when they sin together when they're very closely related. So that's incest, generally speaking. But there could be some heresy, and it seems in this case some heresy attempting to justify such practices, or at least marriages amongst people who are too closely related. So the name was given to those who, wishing to favor marriage, is contracted within the degrees of kindred forbidden by the canons. So, it's something you study in canon law, and it's quite complicated, and that's why you have in different moral theology books whole charts of family trees, fictional family trees with names, just placeholder names put in different slots to indicate different individuals and how they're related to one another. Moral theologians put all of that they have everything figured out according to the laws of the church, and then they'll have typically color coding or different shading to different degrees of darkness, different relations, different degrees of relation within which either marriages is absolutely forbidden, or within which it's necessary to get a dispensation before such individuals can marry. And that's something you have to go back to. In any question of who can marry whom, you always have to go back to that, because it doesn't come up all that often, but in any such case, you'd have to go back to it because it's just that complicated. Generally speaking, the laws of the church are pretty straightforward, easy to understand, relatively easy to keep track of, but when it comes to marriages, it's quite complicated. and maybe a couple of other things too, but definitely the marriage law in the church, canonical requirements for marriage, and what is required for validity, for lawfulness, all of that is quite complicated. But definitely, yes, today we cannot grant any dispensation, so we just have to make sure that two people who are trying to marry each other want to get married, that not only are they free to marry, period, both of them are free to marry in general, but that they are also specifically free to marry each other without any kind of dispensation being necessary. Definitely for validity. Potentially, there could be a case in which you apply Pikeia to something that might otherwise block it on the grounds of being unlawful, but you have to take that case by case. But definitely nothing that concerns validity, we cannot. It's definitely impossible to grant any dispensation for that. It's just not, there are no grounds on which to suppose that there could be any supplied jurisdiction for that. So lawfulness, maybe, I think it could sometimes be applied to those. In principle, it could, I suppose, but not for validity. Cannot run that risk, obviously. All right, so yeah, we have to keep in mind that obviously, in the case of marriage, it's something very public. And the marriage has to be valid, otherwise people are living in public sin. And their children are being born into an illegitimate union, and there's a high chance they'll lose their souls because of that. Higher chance, anyway, as far as we can tell, humanly speaking, than in cases of children born to legitimate Catholic marriages. And Catholic meaning, of course, in this case, actually Catholic, traditional Catholic. So the name was given to those who, wishing to favor a marriage contracted within the degrees of kindred, forbidden by the canons, refused to measure the decrees according to the law of the church, but followed the custom of the Roman law, which placed brother and sister in the second degree. Which, of course, the church does not say that. So we are justified, says St. Peter Damian, in calling them incestuous, since by their loose teaching they authorize unlawful unions, real incests anathematized by the church. All right, so in a council held at Rome in 1065, Alexander II decided that the degrees of kindred relative to marriage must be regulated according to the canons, which place brothers and sisters in the first degree and not according to the Roman law in the second. So it seems that there's actually some debate as to, everybody agrees that incest is contrary to the natural law. That is definitely clear. But there seems to be some debate as to different opinions anyway, not necessarily a heated debate, but some different opinions, different explanations, different possibilities put forth as to why exactly it's contrary to the natural law. And there are there are possibly multiple different reasons why it is. And one of those is actually that it doesn't do any favor to the children of, even if it's a valid marriage, one that's might not be any sin by reason of unlawfulness according to the laws of the church. Everything might be correct in that sense, but it doesn't do any favor typically to the offspring of such a marriage that they take place. Because it's a question of genetics, which is a lower science than what we're looking at now, but there's a much higher chance when the parents are too closely related that the offspring will be in poor health. All kinds of different genetic illnesses get passed on that way. Not going too much into it, I'm claim to be an expert anyway, but typically genetic illnesses are carried by what they call recessive genes, ones that don't come out as easily as other ones do. And so someone might carry that particular gene, but it doesn't actually manifest itself, it doesn't actually cause that person to be ill, unless both the parents carry it, both give it to the person, and then it comes out. And then that person has born with some kind of deformity or a mental illness or any kind of other illness, all kinds of different health problems of every description that could be carried by genetics. For example, very famously, the son of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II was the name of the last Tsar of Russia, but his son had was called hemophilia, which is the inability for one's blood to clot, which means that such a person could potentially bleed to death from just a minor cut. So just imagine someone could scrape his elbow or something and bleed to death from something as minor as that, or maybe that might be a little bit much, but just a minor cut with a knife or something, just by accident while chopping food or something, someone with that condition could bleed out from that. That's something that's carried by recessive genes, and the reason for that was, well, all of those monarchs at that time, all of the royal families that were in power in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, they were all related to Queen Victoria. So they were all, and the gene pool was getting too small, and so all of these genetic illnesses were coming out. So ultimately that came from, I guess it was the question of the son of the Tsar of Russia, but he Nicholas II and Wilhelm II of Germany, those two emperors, they were related, fairly closely related. They were, I think they want to say they were cousins or second cousins, but they were both related, both descending from Queen Victoria. That's what happens. Typically, it happens in those higher levels of society amongst royal families, where political, diplomatic motives for marriages cause people who are too closely related to get married. And maybe the church allows dispensation for it, but definitely doesn't do any favors to the offspring. And that's just one of the reasons why it's contrary to the way incest, simply so called, is contrary to the natural idea. It's even more likely in cases of just simple incest, such things. So there are other explanations put forth, but this is one of them. Also, the famous Habsburg jaw, that was a recessive gene carried out, manifesting itself frequently in that family because too small a gene pool. And that's not a tremendous problem. To have an unusually prominent jaw is not the end of the world. That's not like having a mental illness or potentially bleeding out from a minor cut or something like that. But that does happen with too small a gene pool. All right. So the council at Rome, we mentioned that. The contention of the same council was, however, called to a far more serious matter. The metropolitan see of Florence was filled by a notoriously seminarical prelate, Peter of Pavia, who openly sold ecclesiastical dignities and profaned the holiness of his ministry by the most infamous conduct. His accusers in the Council of Rome offered to prove the truth of their charges, according to the manners of the age, by the judgment of God, known as the ordeal of fire. So we've mentioned this before. I think it was this year we mentioned that, months ago by now. But that such things typically are just tempting God. It's a superstition, attributing the power to something that doesn't actually have, and also tempting God, calling upon him to intervene in a way that he does not intervene usually. Or even more generally speaking, just calling upon God to do anything he doesn't usually do. Now, sometimes you might see, of course, saints who prayed for, who promised that a miracle will be worked on some occasion. That's because they had some kind of inspiration to know that would be the case. But there are different ways of tempting God. One of actually that moral theologians mention is to pray for graces that we're not meant to receive. So, or to pray, or graces received to an extent that we're not meant to receive them. So to pray for graces equal to those received by the Blessed Virgin, for example, would be a case of tempting God. Because those were privileges, those gifts and graces, the extent of her gifts were meant for her alone. Not meant for, the rest of us are not meant to receive that. And God, there's all these, we're talking about perfectly free gifts of God. He can distribute them as he sees fit. He sees fit only to grant those particular gifts. And some of them special to Our Lady, but definitely the extent of them special to Our Lady. Not meant for the rest of us. So that's just one way of tempting God. And to call upon God to manifest his will in some way that, by trial, by battle, or by drowning or fire or something like that. God does not usually act in that way. Usually you throw someone in water, tie it bound hand and feet, that person's going to sink, whether he's guilty or innocent of whatever crime he's suspected of. Throw someone in a fire, is going to burn to death, whether or not he's committed any crime. God does not usually intervene that way. Typically, the laws of the physical universe take their effect without regard to anybody's moral guilt in anything. That's not to say God could never manifest his will in that way or manifest the truth in that way. He could, certainly, but for people to call upon and to demand that of God is to tempt God. That's why the Pope refused to receive such proofs, and without judgment in the case, withheld judgment in the case until he should have obtained more ample information. So just ordinary evidence gathered according to the normal means available for acquiring morally certain proofs and evidence, as you would ordinarily use in any court of law, in any kind of a trial, whether civil or ecclesiastical. So the delay was productive of fatal results. Minds were embittered. Again, that's a problem that's on their part, not on the Pope's part. He's acting in a completely normal way here. You would not. Just imagine being the Pope in this situation. You're not going to accept a proof carried out by trial by fire, because you know that obviously that's not, God does not usually manifest his will that way, does not usually demonstrate the truth that way. The bishop, instead of profiting of the delay to reform his life and morals, redoubled his acts of injustice and violence. His revolted subjects drove him out of the episcopal city, so the people got fed up with him. Yeah, that's going, seems a bit far. I mean, conceivably somebody could be so bad that might be justified to physically remove the person from some place, but as this is stated right here, it sounds like they're going a bit too far. And there are ways they can do. You could do things to prevent someone who's in a position of power from doing evil things without revolting openly against that person. Resist it, yes, definitely evil rulers. And we're talking about people who do in fact have still authority, still are taking care of the common good and have all things necessary to actually hold authority, but who are using their position of power and influence in unauthorized ways that God himself does not actually authorize. All authority comes from God, and ultimately every act of authority is authorized by God himself, therefore. Ultimately. But there are certain things that God would clearly never authorize, and therefore nobody has the authority to carry them out, to do them. And that simony is definitely one of those things. God is always offended by that, could never authorize it, therefore no one in any position of authority ever has the authority to commit such sins. So in the subject of someone who is in power, a legitimate ruler over legitimate subjects, who ordinarily speaking, those subjects are required to obey their ruler, whoever he might be, a bishop in this case, in ecclesiastical matters, they definitely can resist his attempts to carry on simoniacal dealings, because that's not something he has the authority to do. When they resist him in that, they're resisting him just as a private individual who's committing sin. And they can seek to prevent that, just as they would seek to prevent anybody from committing sin. So it sounds as though they went too far, and that resistance can go too far. Resisting someone who is in a position of authority, who is trying to do things that are not authorized, he does not have the authority to do, that's okay. Obviously, what has to be done according to legitimate means and to a proportionate extent. But things can go too far, and definitely that does not give anybody the title to remove that person from any position of authority. Certainly not in the church, and not even in the civil order, but definitely not in the church. And there are limits to that. So negotiations, so it sounds as though they went too far, though you have to examine the exact details of the case a bit more to see whether that is actually the case. Negotiations were then opened between Peter of Pavia and the Florentines. In contempt of the earnest prohibition of the sovereign pontiff, they mutually agreed to settle the question by the ordeal of fire. So the Pope is forbidding that. Don't do that. He's been quite clear. They decided to do it anyway. So two immense piles were raised, so piles of wood, raised in the public square of Florence, 2 feet apart. So the word piling, and it sounds like boards of wood or something. It means in this case bundles of sticks closely bound together. So you definitely have a lot of fuel there, but also allows air to pass in between, so fire can actually burn. So I think a little bit of older use of the term, but there you go. So a holy monk named Peter, afterwards celebrated under the name of Peter Ignius, in reference to what's about to happen, was chosen, so a fiery one, was chosen by the bishop's accusers to undergo the formidable test and thus prove the truth of their complaints. The piles were kindled, and when they were wrapped in a sheet of flame, Peter Ignius, robed in priestly vestments, appeared in the midst of the crowd. So if it says a prayer, we have the words, the exact words right there. He made the sign of the cross and then calmly advanced into the midst of the flames, treading the burning wood under his bare feet. And long story short, he came out, in this case, due to a true miracle, it seems, according to our author, came out unharmed due to miraculous protection. So perhaps it started as an act of tempting God, but God in his providence saw fit to actually intervene on this particular occasion. And that would clearly, and this is clearly miraculous. You don't walk through a huge fire like that completely, and just wearing priestly vestments with bare feet and come out completely unharmed. Except through, I mean, clearly it seems to have been clear to everyone who was there that there is no other explanation than a miracle. God can choose to do that. And sometimes, yes, things can start with an evil, superstitious, gravely sinful practice when God could still intervene. For example, in the books of Kings, King Saul went to it was after the prophet Samuel had died. He wanted to consult him again. He went to a witch to try to communicate with the prophet Samuel from beyond the grave. And commentators explain it that that witch tried to do whatever weird stuff she was doing, or gravely sinful stuff, to try to communicate with the prophet Samuel. And it would usually take a while, whether or not there's any demonic activity, you have to examine that, but it would take some time before anything would even seem to happen. But in that instance, prophet Samuel appeared right away, and that was a true apparition allowed by divine providence, truly of the prophet Samuel communicating with King Saul. And even it's I can't recall if it's clear from the text of sacred scripture itself, but the commentators say that even the witch was surprised by that, how quickly the prophet appeared, because it happened much more quickly than it usually did. Yeah, or anything happened, if anything happened at all. But a lot of times, even some people trying to, the spiritism and all of that stuff, it's gravely sinful. Seances and all that stuff is gravely sinful, definitely. But many times such things are just fake. People who know, are experts on it, say that it's about 99% fake, 1% demonic activity. But mostly just fakery, mostly just fraudulent stuff going on. That's still gravely sinful, no doubt about it. But just relatively very little of it is actually the activity of the devil. All right, so in this case, there's this instance is a true miracle that we're looking at here. So the account of this wonderful event, witnessed by the whole city of Florence, was sent to Pope Alexander, who saw in it the finger of God. He deposed the Bishop of Florence and made St. Peter Ignaeus Cardinal Archbishop of Albano. So the incredulous minds of later days pretend to class this prodigious event amongst the legends of the Middle Ages. Frankly, I've been much more trusting of people in the Middle Ages to recognize a miracle than people disbelieving, very low characters espousing all sorts of absurd ideas who weren't there from much later centuries to assess those things. So the divine gift of miracles belonged to the Catholic Church in the 11th century as truly as it does in the present. Though it is actually interesting to note that it's one of the signs of the end times that there will not be any more miracles. And the reason is that lest the faithful, those who are faithful, confuse the prodigies, the false miracles, not true miracles, but the prodigies that will be worked by the followers of the Antichrist, trying to prove that he's something special. Notice there haven't been any real miracles, at least not very few verified real miracles in recent history, which is a little disconcerting, obviously. I mean, there are other signs of the approaching end of the world. We don't know when. Might be a long time yet. Could be that everybody who's alive on Earth will pass away by the time the end of the world actually comes. We just don't know. But some of the approaching signs of the end of the world are coming, or have already been accomplished. But that's another story. So certainly in the Middle Ages, you expect miracles to be worked in the Middle Ages much more than today. All right, let's see. Seems I doubled one of these pages, at least in part. That's okay. All right, so The whole population of Florence witnessed one, public, manifest, and splendid. So it seems there's no other explanation but a true miracle. And keep in mind, there are criteria listed for how to ascertain a true miracle from a false one. Some prodigious event that perhaps it could have been done by the action of the activity of the devil. Divine providence allowing that for some purpose, permitting that to happen, tolerating that at least. That's something you study in De Revelazione. Is that being given this year in the De Revelazione course? No?
We're taking it this year.
Okay. All right. So if you haven't seen that yet, then you will see it. But true miracle is, for example, one of the most obvious things. A true miracle is never anything weird. For example, a prodigy that might be worked by the power of the devil could be somebody ripping open, to use too graphic an example, but someone cutting himself open, pulling out his entrails and putting them back in without any mark being left. A true miracle would never be something like that. That's weird and disgusting. God would never choose to work a miracle, exercise his power to prove the truth of something that someone is saying by doing something like that. So that's something it's a prodigy, but the power of the devil could do that. Yeah, angels, keep in mind, angels are extremely powerful creatures. They're far, far more powerful than we are by nature. Now, the dignity of the priesthood is higher than the dignity of the angels, but the angelic nature in itself is far more powerful than human nature. So angels can have power over material things that to us that for them it's just natural. They can do it. It's just part of what they can do by nature, but to us would appear supernatural. And that's why I call it preternatural things that happen, things done by angelic activity. All allowed by divine providence, all of it under his control, the control of God, of course, as everything is. But still what we call preternatural occurrences because it's done by angelic activity. So an angel, obviously angels don't have bodies, but sometimes angels do communicate directly with human beings. That's in multiple instances of that in sacred scripture itself. But the power of angels is such that they can just manipulate matter. They can manipulate air and sound waves so that we could be absolutely convinced that we're talking to a human person. They're having a conversation with just a person who has just a human being who's using the vocal cords of his body as usual to communicate. But at the end of the conversation, the angel could say, "Oh, by the way, this is just sound waves and light waves are interacting with here. This is angelic activity." An angel could do that for sure. No question. That's the power that they have. And whether that's actually the case in any given instance or not is another thing. But that's definitely within angelic power. So the power to work that prodigy we described earlier, that if divine providence were to allow that to happen for some reason, then that's something that the power of the devil could affect. So that's just one. There are multiple criteria. And when it comes to the process of canonization, to determine a true miracle, for example, the healing of a person, there are multiple things to consider. Many things. It has to be thoroughly examined. So what that means, all of that means, is that sometimes people nowadays hear accounts, oh, there's an apparition and a miracle or something. People can't just proclaim that on their own. They can't just read something on the internet and decide that, oh, this is a true private revelation because of some miracle. And that's something that the authority of the church has to judge, has to carry out a very thorough investigation, gathering all the facts, taking all the necessary time and effort to do so. And even then, the pronouncement would never be more than, well, this seems to be the case. Definitely no layperson has the authority to pronounce upon that to any extent whatsoever. It takes the authority of the church to just make a prudent judgment about it. At least one that we can safely follow. And somebody might investigate him with motive of credibility, might think, okay, I don't see anything wrong with this, but even so, you need the authority of the church before you can really accept it. All right. Nome Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen, sub tuum presidium confugimus, sancta Rei Genetrix, nostros supplicationes et despicias, in necessitatibus repliquis cunctis libera nos semper, virgo gloriosa et benedicta. Nome Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen.